Chapter 2, something I left last time, which is page 5. Sources of data. That here, as I say, shouldn't take too long, but there are some bits of terminology to learn. The management accountant needs to collect data for several things. And it could be, for instance, I want to know what the average wages are of my employees to do some report. We need that data. And a couple of things. First of all, paragraph 2, it says primary and secondary sources of data. I'll write down, if you like, a definition in a moment. But what I'm getting at, or what we are getting at, is this. Suppose I wanted to know the average age of my employees. All right? I could get it simply by going out and asking everybody, how old are you, and then working out an average. You agree? Alternatively, and more likely, perhaps I've already got your ages in my files. I collected your ages when you joined, not because at that stage I wanted an average. It's that I needed your ages for other reasons. And obviously if I already know your ages, then I can get them off my files and just add them up and divide. True? Well, depending on how you're getting the information, the data, we call it primary or secondary. And what primary data is when it's collected specifically for the reason for a purpose. It's secondary when we're using data already there. Or put it another way, already collected for other reasons. So I'll pause a minute while you're writing it, but it's only terminology. If you're collecting it specifically for a purpose, we call it primary. If we're using data that's already available but was collected for other reasons, then it's secondary. All right? But be careful, it can be slightly confusing. Let me give you a couple of examples. Suppose I want to know the average wage of my employees. Well, certainly I'll have wages already in my computer. You would agree? I don't need to go and ask you. And so, if I worked out the average wage of my employees that way, would I be using primary data or secondary? Secondary. The wages are already there. They were collected for another reason, but since they're there, I may as well use them. Well, I can work out the average. It's secondary. All right? That's fairly obvious, but what about this? I want to know, let's say, the average wage of people in Latvia. Well, suppose I went out and asked everyone in Latvia and worked out an average. Would that be primary or secondary? That'd be primary. You're collecting it specially. More likely, of course, I'm not going to go around and ask everyone in Latvia. The government has, I don't know what you call it here, every so often they have a census. They go around and ask everybody questions. Yeah? Suppose one of the questions on the Latvian census was how much do you earn? And on the government's website, they've published results and it says average wage of people in Latvia. Would that... And, I want to know what the average wage of people in Latvia is. So I look on their website and it says average wage, 200 lats or whatever. Would that be primary or secondary? Primary. One of the two, good. Yeah, it doesn't matter who's collected it. It's a question of, why did they collect the data? If they collected it so they could work out the average wage in Latvia, then it was collected for the purpose. You with me? Which makes it primary. And so, assuming, you know, the reason they have the census is they wanted one of the things they could find out, what's the average wage in Latvia, therefore they asked everybody and they worked it out, then that makes it primary data. I'll say again, it doesn't matter who's collected it, if you understand me. If it was collected specifically to find out the average wage, it's primary. If you're just using data that was collected for some other reason, that makes it secondary. Okay? All right, the second thing, though, is if we are collecting data ourselves, you know, if I wanted, forget the government having a census, if I wanted to know the average wage of people in Latvia and I was going to go around and ask people, clearly it's just not realistic for me to go around and ask every person in Latvia, bless you. And so standardly, the way we might approach it is just to take a sample, ask a few people. You know, and if I asked 50 people and their average wage was 200 lats, well, use that to represent the population. Would you agree? Hello? You know, there are lots of times people take samples. Auditors might take samples. Or, what about, I keep getting letters from companies wanting me, telling me what balance they owed me or I owed them. Acts or something. Acts. I keep getting these letters saying, we think at the 30th of June you owed 200 lats or something. And I'm supposed to fill in something, you know, whether it was 200 or it wasn't. Yeah? I always throw them all. Anyway. Fine. However, fairly obviously, there's perhaps a situation where, I don't know, instead of asking everybody, which is the only way you'd get a perfect answer, more likely, perhaps, you'd take a sample, ask a few, and if a few are perfect, assume that they all are. You all know what I'm getting at. But what you can be asked, and it's only, again, writing, no numbers, is different ways you might go about taking a sample. All right? But are you all clear what we're talking about? You know, there are 2 million people in Latvia. I'm going to collect data about average wage. Maybe I'll ask 100 people a sample and use that as representative. All right? Well, I say there are different ways depending on why you're doing it and the work involved and so on. And that's note paragraph 5. You'll see, and it is really just terminology, random sampling, systematic sampling and so on. Well, it's just being clear about what we mean by each of them. Okay? So let me go through them. Well, I'll do it by example. I think it makes it clear. But regardless. First of all, random sampling is where you pick a certain number. Let's suppose I'm going to pick 50 people. But pure random sampling is when you're picking 50, but all 50 have an equal chance of being picked. All right? So there's no bias or anything. Each of the 50 has an equal chance of being picked. You're picking them purely at random. Now the problem there is, how are you going to pick them at random? You can't just walk along the street and say, I'll pick you and then I'll pick you, you know? There's bias. Which street do you walk along? If you pick people in Riga, clearly people in Riga are likely to earn more perhaps than people in the country. Yeah? Again, if I go around the country just picking people at random, without intending, you may pick some people that look nice and not pick people who don't look nice. Yeah? You know what I mean? And so the problem with pure random sampling is you would need, the only way you can do it purely random would be to give every item a number, you know, to number everybody in Riga from 1 to 2 million, and then to pick some numbers at random, you know, like tossing a dice, where it's purely at random. Or you can get tables which have a whole series of numbers that are just a computer's generated at random. But the only way you can have a completely random sample is, as I say, if you can attach a number to every one, pick some number, pick 50 numbers at random, and then ask those 50. Are we all clear? Now, for the population in Riga, that's virtually impossible to do. Something like invoices, if I wanted to check some invoices, maybe it is possible. If my invoices for this year, I number them all, and if they're numbered 1 to 5,000, everyone's got a number. Pick 50 numbers at random. Pick those invoices. That would be a pure random sample. All right? So, to write all that down is a bit over the top. But the problem with a random sample is you can only do that if we have what we call a sampling frame. What I mean is that we have to give each item in the population, well, this is writing down what I said, give each item in the population a number and then pick numbers at random. Now, giving each item in the population a number, we call that the sampling frame. There are 2 million people. There's my frame. They've all got a number. There are 5,000 invoices. There's my frame. That's the population. They've all got a number. And then we pick some of them at random. Okay? Now, that would be the ideal. But there are 2 problems. One is that's likely to be quite expensive. Not always, I know, perhaps not for invoices, but certainly giving everyone in Latvia a number or something. That's quite likely to be expensive. And, of course, it just might be impossible. I mean, theoretically, yes, but again, to number everybody in Latvia and do this, I think you'd agree, it's more or less out of the question. All right? Well, that's a pure random sample. That would be the ideal. However, in real life, because of the problems, more commonly, we'll do one of the following bits. The first one being what we call systematic sampling. And what we do with systematic sampling is this. For example, because the numbers can change as you'll see, we're not going to ask every person, we're not going to check every invoice. Clearly, we're only going to have a sample. What I might do is this, though. Start with the, let's say, 8th item, and then check every 20th. Now, there can be problems, we'll discuss in a minute, but as I say, instead of having to give everyone a number and then picking numbers at random, if it's invoices, perhaps check the 8th invoice, you know, they're all filed, check the 8th one, and then go through and check every 20th. Again, I'm checking a sample, but I didn't have to, well, A, I didn't have to put numbers on them all, I can just go through them one by one. And secondly, we didn't have to go through picking numbers at random. It just becomes automatic. Do you see what I mean there? I mean, there's nothing magical about 8 and 20. They're any numbers. Depends how many there are. You know, if there are 2 million in Latvia, you could say, right, let's check every 100th or something. But you start with one at random, but then you're systematic. You check every 20th or every 50th or every 15th, and so on. Clear? But that's systematic. And all right, although in some senses that is random, there can be a problem in that, perhaps I'm being a bit silly here, but it's just possible, however unlikely, that if these were invoices perhaps on average, I send out 20 invoices a week. All right? And I know it's a strange coincidence, but it could happen that if I send 20 a week, it could be, if I've decided to check every 20th for some reason, that every 20th is the last one on a Friday. You know, maybe the last one on a Friday is when people are tired and is more likely there's some bias. You with me? And so, it's not completely random. It could end up being a bit biased. I say, and the last one on a Friday is perhaps the one that's most likely to have mistakes in it. But it's one possible way, it's quite a common way. and you don't need the same sampling frame. You don't need to know exactly how many there are. If you're checking every 20th, you just carry on until you've finished. Okay? Anyway, have I made that clear? Systematic. All right, the next one is one you'll all recognise, I'm sure, but stratified. What we do with stratified is, let me give you an example. Suppose I wanted to check, I wanted to ask people, or find out, I beg your pardon, how much they spend on cosmetics, on average. Yeah? Face cream or something. Now, clearly, it's very likely that women spend more on face cream than men. You would agree? Well, if I take a purely random sample, it's always possible, if it's purely at random, that you might end up asking all women or you might end up asking all men. Would you agree? It's possible. And so, what we do with stratified is divide our population and say, let's split them into women and men. And let's say, if 60% of the population are women and 40% are men, let's pick one sample of women, let's pick one sample of men, and make sure there are 60% and 40%. So if we're going to ask 50 people, don't just pick any old 50, which just could happen to be all men or all women. True? If we know the population is 60% women, let's pick 30 women at random from the women, and let's pick 20 men at random from the men. All right? But that's stratified. It's where you divide the population. I'll give you another example in a minute, but divide population into categories, like men, women, and then pick a random sample from each. Another example, those I said about people checking balances, sending out letters saying, does the balance agree? Well, if I have 1,000 customers, instead of just picking any 50 of those 1,000 at random, what I might do is split the balances and say, we'll look at, there are this many who've got balances they owe more than 100. There are this many who owe between 0 and 100. And there are this many customers who owe nothing at all. So I've got 3 categories. Big balances, small balances, balance 0. And then pick a sample from each of them. All right? So you split it into categories, and then it's random from each. And the beauty of that, surely, is in one sense it's better. I said before, there's always that danger at random, if you don't split them, that you pick all men, all women, or you accidentally pick all big balances or all zeros. Yeah? So in that sense it's better. People in Latvia are women to be able to do what I said before. I need to know what proportion of my balances are big balances, small balances, etc., to be able to do it. Well, for invoices, balances rather, that's relatively easy, but it's not always possible. Okay? However, are we clear with that one? Multi-stage. Now, be careful, because if I don't make this clear, shout. Because at a quick read, it seems very similar to stratified. And it's I can't say the bloody word stratified, but it's actually slightly different. Suppose I'm checking my invoices. I want to do a sample. I've got 10,000 invoices this year. And I want to check 100 of them. Okay? Well, as an alternative to having to number all 10,000, picking 100 numbers at random, I could split them into blocks. Let's split them into blocks of 100. The first 100 invoices, the second 100 invoices, the third 100. And then, from each block of 100, let's pick 5 at random. All right? And so, multi-stage. Split the population Now be careful here. It's not splitting it into categories, men, women, big balances, small balances. It's split the population into groups or blocks, e.g. first 100, second 100, and so on, and then select at random from each block. So again, I do hope I'm making this clear. If I have 1,000 invoices and I want to check 100 of them, instead of taking all 1,000, picking 100 of those 1,000 at random, if I split it into blocks of 100, well, with 1,000 invoices, there are 10 blocks. And if I want to check 100 in total, get 10 from each of the blocks. Okay? So it's like taking 10 separate little samples. It's always 10 separate little populations. But again, first 100, second 100, etc. Okay? Sorry?
If I would like to check invoices, for example,
Yeah.
and I can split them by months and then check for 5, for example, for each month.
Oh yeah, that'd be another way. That'd be another way. It's the same idea, multi-stage. Yeah. To say there are 12 months. All right, January we'll pick 10, February we'll pick 10, and so on. They're at random within each block. So you said, all right, January there are 1,000, I'll pick 100 at random, you know. But you're doing each block separately rather than just one big population. All right? All right. Well, all of those are different variations on random. You know, that one. They picked at random within each block, and so on. The next two, the last two, are slightly different. The first is cluster sampling. And actually, I better write in, these two, as I explain, are what we call non-random. You'll see what I mean in a minute. They're not as good, but they are quite popular sometimes in real life. And you'll see immediately why it's not as good. Cluster sampling. Suppose I wanted to know, again, average wage in Latvia. All right? I say, as we started, the only way I could find out for certain would be to ask every single person in Latvia, and that's obviously not practical. And so I take a sample. All right, earlier, take a completely random sample where it could be anybody in the country, you know, and use their average. But what cluster would be is perhaps, instead of numbering all the population and everything, which is impossible, let's just take a sample in Riga, which is easier because it's smaller. Or pick a small town, you know. It's even easier. Pick Bauska or something, where obviously there are fewer people. Take a sample from Bauska and say, if the average in that group is 200 Lats, assume that's representative of the whole of Latvia. Now I think you see immediately why that's not terribly good. Clearly, Bauska isn't representative of the whole of Latvia. At least I wouldn't have thought it was. Obviously, Riga isn't. I think I'm right. The people in Riga are more likely to earn more on average than the rest of the country. And so it's a very dangerous one. It's only valid if you really knew Bauska was the average for Latvia, sort of thing. But it is quite common. You know, market research often, when they're going out taking samples, do people like this new toothpaste or something? They quite often just pick one group, perhaps pick Bauska, and assume the results from Bauska are representative for the whole of Latvia. All right? But you see what I mean when I say it's not a random sample? It's very dangerous. But cluster is where you pick one section of the population. You assume, and that's the problem, you assume it is representative of the whole population. And because there's always the danger, I don't know, I'm trying to write it nicely, but because of the danger you look back later and it's not clear, I mean, my example, e.g. Riga, look at Riga and then assume it's representative of Latvia. But as I said before, there's an obvious situation when it was wages or something where it's certainly not going to be representative. It's terribly dangerous. On some things maybe, you know? But it is, well, I don't need to keep on. You all see the problem. Last of all, for the exam at any rate, quota sampling. Don't confuse this with an earlier one. They often use this for things like voting. You know, if the elections, or the election was coming up, the newspapers print, they carry out some research and they print predictions. You agree? And what they do, they don't go to all the lengths of counting everybody in Latvia and using random numbers and everything. What they tend to do is pick people at random in the street and ask them, all right? Also, maybe here they do different, they ring people up or whatever. But they tend to pick people in the street and ask them, pick people at random. And perhaps to make it fairer, they say, oh, maybe men and women might vote differently. And so they'll say, we're going to ask 200 people to try and make it a bit fairer. If 60% are women and 40% men, let's just keep asking people as they come past. Out of 200, make sure you ask 120 women and make sure you ask 80 men, or whatever it comes to. But you give the person instructions, they stand in the street, they keep stopping people, and as soon as they've got up to the number of people they were supposed to ask, 120 women, they stop asking women. Once they've got 80 men, they stop asking men. All right? Well, that's quota. Quota sampling is basically, I'll put people, I mean obviously it's not always people, it could be anything, but ask items as they appear. I'm trying to write it more generally. But you're not picking things at random at all, you're just stopping people as they come past. Until you've reached the desired number or quota. And it can be as simple as, I want to find out what beer people drink. I send you Katerina out in the street and ask the first 200 people she come to. That's her quota. Or I can refine it a bit, as I said before. I pay you Katerina, I say go out and ask 200 people, but make sure you ask 120 women and 80 men, you know. But then she just stops people in the street, ticks them off until she's got to that number. Okay? So, if you want an example, e.g., 120 women, 80 men. Well, I hardly need to write down more, although that is obviously, of all of them, probably the easiest to do. At the same time, surely that is the most dangerous of all. But stand in the street, I mean really, where you stand makes a difference, surely. If you stand outside the Hotel Latvia or something, obviously a lot of the people you ask might be tourists who might be completely unrepresentative of Latvia. Equally, if you're walking around the street, there's less likely to be sick people, you know, because they're lying in bed. You know, they might have different opinions about things. It's nice and easy. It is very common for market research type things. But it's not terribly scientific, and it's certainly not at all random. Okay? All right, well, I hope those make sense. I'm sorry there are a lot of words, but all they can ask, no numbers whatsoever. All they can check on, and there won't be many. I'd be amazed if there are more than 2 or at most 3 questions in the exam. But the problem is, obviously, even if there are only 2 or even 1, they could be testing you on any of those. It is really just learning the words. Okay? And so just for a few minutes, can you turn to page 7, where they're all indicative of them. The first one, let's do the first one together, because the first one, I think, hard's the wrong word, but I think it's the one that needs most thought. And in fact, one of them, you could perhaps argue, but it says, which of the following are examples of secondary data? And remember, secondary data is data that wasn't collected specifically for the use we're making of it. All right? A count of the number of invoices we're issuing each week. Would that be primary data or would it be secondary? If you go out and specifically collect data for the reason you want it, it's primary. If you're using data that's already lying around somewhere, it's secondary. Is this primary or secondary? It is secondary, it is. The invoices are already lying around. I know you've had to count them, but they're already there. They're there for different reasons, obviously. If for some reason I need to know how many do we issue each week, I didn't have to go out and do any research. Clearly, it's there. I just count what's there. It's secondary data. All right? You know, it's not quite as obvious, but a bit like wages. If I had to go and actually ask how much you earned, that's primary. If I've already got it on file and I just take it and add them up and divide, that's secondary. Okay? So number one is secondary. What about the average wage of the population taken from government census results? I effectively said this. Yeah, that's primary. Presumably the government collected it specially for that reason. So even though it wasn't me who collected it, it doesn't matter. It was collected specifically for the reason that's primary. The average wage paid to our employees. Sorry, I just said this, but still tell me. The average wage paid to our employees. Secondary, yeah. Clearly, I will have wages in my records, whatever else I do or I don't. And finally, although, if you look at the choices, we now know the answer. The sales for the month is reported on a website. Primary, yeah. And so the answer is C. Is it 1 and 3? Yeah. All right, the other three are really just testing on definitions, or two of them are. Look back if you need. I don't expect you to have learnt them. But can you ever go at 2, 3 and 4? All right, let's have a check. I don't spend too long on this. Question 2. A sample of people is taken with the same proportion of individuals in separate age bands as in the population as a whole. You were all clear, I hope, what I meant? This is an example of which type? Which type of sampling, anybody? Say again? Oh, no. Cluster would be, you know, just using one group as representative of the whole population. It's not cluster. Anybody? Well, that wasn't one of the choices, I'm afraid. It's stratified. It's stratified. That if the population as a whole, you know, if 20% are young and 80% are old, make sure we pick a sample. Pick 20% young and 80% old. Pick up random from each of the bits of the population. All right? It's stratified. Are we clear? What about question 3? We're taking a sample by selecting the 12th and thereafter every 20th. This should have been easy enough. That's precisely systematic. There's nothing special about the first one being the 12th or it being every 20th. There could be any numbers you wanted, but that's systematic. Question 4. Now, one or two of these are slightly debatable, but since only one of these, no, there's only one right answer, I think one of them really stands out. Which of the following statements about stratified sampling is true? Anybody?
C.
It is C. That to stratify, I still can't say the word, to stratify, you need to know you've got 80% women, 20% men, or whatever it is. So you need that information about the population before you can design your sample. All right? And so it only works, it's only possible if you have that information. The others, I say you could debate a little bit, but I think they're all okay. The sample will not be representative. Yes, it is if it's done properly. The structure will not reflect that of the population. Well, the whole point is it does reflect that of the population. The sample is chosen entirely at random. You could argue slightly, but it certainly is at random within each group. All right? So the correct answer is C. That's a beautiful picture, Liga. Are we all happy there? I was actually being sarcastic. It's a horrible picture, but still. All right. All right, well, I won't go on there. I've said enough. I hope that's clear. But obviously do take the time, go back and learn them, because it's one of those things, I think you'd agree, even though it means learning half a dozen different types. Once you have learnt them, even if it is only 1, 2 questions, they're then, I think, relatively easy. Okay? While I'm there, incidentally, the next chapter, a bit like that other one I mentioned, you were supposed to be reading yourselves, chapter 3, do you remember? Did anybody?
Yeah.
Oh, good, good. However, I'm certainly not talking through chapter 3. If you haven't read it, make sure you've read it before the revision. Because if you remember, it was just looking at the pictures. Again, it's names. What's likely in the exam, the way they'd ask it, just look at page 11. Page 11 for 1 second. That bottom thing there is called a pie chart. Even if you haven't looked at those pages, I think it's probably fairly obvious immediately. The way they'd probably ask it, well, the only way they could ask it, is the exam might have a picture of a pie chart, that picture there, and say, this is an example of which type of chart, and then list bar chart, pie chart, etc. Are you with me? Which is really easy marks, as long as you've taken the trouble to go through and check what each is. So if you haven't read, please do. And if my pictures there don't make it clear, then obviously ask me. I've tried to make them clear, but ask me if not, please. But otherwise, I think that's easy.